Every weapon in Vermintide has a specific purpose that it fills to allow you to get the most out of your preferred playstyle. For those who have been playing for hundreds of hours, it is easy to recall which weapon is the best at what, but for those who are newer to the game, you have no frame of reference, and therefore no way to tell which weapon is good at what. When you hover over a weapon, towards the bottom you will see a short line of text made up of 3 or more words colored green. These are referred to as the characteristics of a weapon, which serve as a way to give the player an idea of what that specific weapon does best. Some of these characteristics are pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, but a few of them will leave you confused as they don't explain exactly what they mean. Which is why today we are going to cover all of the weapon characteristics in Vermintide and go over exactly what they mean. A few side notes to mention first though. Characteristics are categorized in 3 different ways: melee, ranged, and both. We won't be going in any specific order, but I will be sure to say what kind of weapons you might find this specific characteristic on. Also, while most characteristics on weapons make sense or can have an argument be made in their favor, on some weapons they simply don't make sense when you compare all of the weapons that share that characteristic. This list is my look at all of the characteristics in Vermintide, what weapons they are found on, and what the characteristic means based upon the similarities that all the weapons that have that characteristic share. To start us off, armor piercing is a predominantly melee characteristic that is found on weapons that can pierce armor with both light and heavy attacks, like one-handed axe, although it is also found on throwing axes, which is a ranged weapon. Close range is a ranged characteristic that refers to ranged weapons that are designed to be used at a close range, like shotguns or the Drake gun. Crowd control is both a melee and ranged characteristic that refers to weapons that have high cleave, high stagger, high unarmored damage, or any mixture of these 3 on any of their attacks, making it best used to keep large hordes under control, like shielded weapons or the fireball staff. Fast attacks is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that have at least one attack that winds up and releases faster than other weapons in Vermintide, like one-handed sword or rapier. Damage over time is a predominantly ranged characteristic that refers to weapons that have at least one of their attacks apply a damage over time effect to enemies, like Sienna staves, although it can also be found on dual daggers since their light attacks applies a blood DOT. Headshot damage is a melee and ranged characteristic that refers to weapons that have an increased finesse modifier, or an increased headshot damage modifier making them do more damage on headshots, like bolt staff or executioner sword. Heavy charged attack is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that have different levels of heavy attacks that do different amounts of damage. Currently, it is only found on Barden's Warpick, but it also applies to rapier and bolt staff since they also have different levels of heavy attack. High damage is a melee and ranged characteristic that refers to weapons who have at least one attack that does a large amount of damage, either to hordes or single targets like dual axes or blunderbuss. High mobility is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that inherently have higher defensive stats, such as effective block angle and inner/outer block cost modifiers, but also have a higher dodge speed and distance bonus as opposed to a lower one. This only applies to Elven's Spear, as this specific weapon has defensive stats most similar to shielded weapons, but also has a higher dodge bonus than shielded weapons do. Ignore shields is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that have at least one attack that completely ignores an enemy's shield. This only appears on the 2 flail weapons in the game, however it also applies to handgun, bolt staff, sword and shield, and many other weapons as they all have at least one attack that also ignores shields. Overheat is a ranged characteristic that refers to weapons that use the overheat mechanic, including Sienna staves and Drakefire weapons. Piercing bolts is a ranged characteristic that refers to bolt-focused weapons that can pierce through armor and cleave through unarmored units with their attacks, which is found on the 3 crossbow weapons in the game. Powerful blocks is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that have a reduced inner block cost modifier, essentially giving them inherent block cost reduction against attacks within their effective block angle. This applies to all shielded weapons in the game. Rapid fire is a ranged characteristic that refers to weapons which have the ability to fire multiple shots in a short time frame, such as repeater handgun and swiftbow. Shield breaking is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons that have at least one attack that can instantly break an enemy's wooden shield instead of being fully absorbed, such as halberd and two-handed hammer. Sniper is a ranged weapon characteristic that refers to weapons that have a greater effective range and reduced damage falloff, making them good for long-range combat, such as longbow or handgun. Versatile is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons who are pretty good at everything, from horde clearing to boss damage to armor killing, like Elven Sword or Sword and Dagger. Finally, wide sweeps is a melee characteristic that refers to weapons in which at least one of their attacks makes large, wide arcing sweeps, allowing them to catch many different enemies in their hitbox, such as Fire Sword and Two-Handed Sword.